When I pressed my quill to parchment in the Ministorum Scriptorium, the candle smoke tasted like old incense and the future. Every line I copied buried a whisper of someone's life under black ink, and with each ledger page, I felt something of myself slip away. I began work at first light, among stone columns that drank the sun and spat it out as a pale, patient heat. The offices behind those columns kept their voices tiny, tucked like prayers into sleeves. Even the footsteps moved with restraint, as if the building itself feared to wake whatever gods listened there. My table was a slab of worn oak beneath a high window. The sill gathered dust in the shape of years. I learned to read the light the way some people read faces. It told you how long the city had been awake, how long the candles would hold, whether the clerks from the lower courts had started their petty wars over stacks of paperwork. The job was ritual. I uncapped the ink with a motion practiced enough to be muscle and memory. I murmured the sanctioned prayers the way workmen nod their heads at a foreman's whistle, because it steadied the hand and because, somewhere, the rites were expected to be performed. The quill tasted of metal at first contact, and the scratch of nib on vellum was a sound I grew to love for its honesty. Each stroke had a geometry to it, the slight dip for an A, the confident slash for a T, the little curl that marked a name with reverence or a condemnation with cold finality. The ledger of the faithful lived between two boards. Its spine sighed when I opened it, as if it too remembered the weight of what it bore. The work made me necessary and invisible at once. Men and women brought their sins and their absolutions to our doors, and we translated their lives into ledger language. A confession arrived as a sealed tube or a whispered note handed across a bench by a trembling acolyte. A penitent's name was given, sometimes with a plea, sometimes with no more than a finger pressed to lips. I copied the words I wrote, what the officiant decreed. I tallied notions of guilt and penance, and I signed the margins when required. People bowed to those who judged. They did not look at the hand that recorded. The ecclesiarchy had no need for those who kept records to be remembered. We were the bones of their structure. Almost a week into the work, I noticed a face blur when I tried to picture it. At first I thought the morning had made me careless. The columns looked different at dawn, I told myself. The candles cast new shadows. I chalked it up to fatigue. But the same blankness returned every time I tried to conjure the woman who had once sat at my table to teach me the proper way to hold a nib. Her hair, the slope of her cheek, the cadence of her laugh, each detail receded, so that soon I could not be certain whether she had preferred black tea or wine. The knowledge collapsed inward in small stages, like a map crumpling along predefined folds. It was a quiet theft. Nothing dramatic snapped, no light went out. Only the edges of recollection softened, then vanished. A memory's metadata, the scent, the minor inflection of a word, the way someone tapped their chin when thinking, was what went first. Later, names followed. Once a name slipped, the things tied to it loosened too. I found myself reading a confession from earlier in the morning and realizing I had no image to hang those words upon. The person became a bundle of facts and petitions and a neat penumbra in the margin. The ledger held everything I held less. There was an odd economy to the office. Clerics measured sins and prescribed penances, but nobody kept an accounting for what a scribe paid. The ecclesiarchy called it duty. To the clergy, duty was an altar where sacrifice went without remark. There was no line in their ledgers for what it cost us to press ink into fleshless names. They expected us to accept loss as grace. I had accepted it at first with the same mechanical piety with which I inked the letters. I told myself that forgetting was a small price to pay for service. I had always liked the sound of being necessary. The method of receiving entries made forgetting easier. They did not hand you whole lives, They handed you fragments in ceremonial increments. A confessor would speak the essentials: name, transgression, the penance to be fulfilled. Sometimes a tremor would pass through them, and the words would be rich and terrible. Sometimes the words were plain as bones. I would write, my quill would move, and the life would fold into the ledger. Later in the day, after the midday bell, and after we had eaten the thin bread warmed on the hall coals, I would rehearse names in my head, trying to keep their faces from going white. I would try to picture the way a mother had pressed her child to her chest, or a merchant's fingers closing on coin, or a soldier's boot staggering over battlements. Each image frayed at the edges. The more I preserved their paperwork, the less I preserved the people. The scriptorium itself enforced the amnesia. The candles kept the room in a low, forgiving light. Secrets looked less threatening, dimly seen. They taught us to work in this penumbra, to let the theological gravity of our handwriting do the remembering for us. The ledger of the faithful required fidelity, not affection. We were encouraged to be precise, not sentimental. I had once believed that precision might protect me. If every letter was careful, if every date exact, maybe the ledger would act as a proxy memory. The thought was vanity. Ink does not resurrect warmth. It does not restore the weight of a hand on your shoulder or the pitch of a laugh in winter. It reduces, it flattens. It preserves the outline and discards the rest. There were oddities in the pages, things that didn't belong to any routine. An older entry, smudged with a thumbprint the color of old wine, would begin with a name and trail off into shorthand only a handful of us could read. In the I margins, someone had once doodled a pair of hands, clasped in prayer. Little human marks like that felt dangerous and precious. I touched them as one might touch a relic that smelled faintly of someone's home. My fingers remembered their warmth even when my mind would not. I began to hoard small tokens in secret: a pressed ribbon, a scrap of handwriting on the edge of a confession, the curl of a dried flower someone had left in a book. These were private ledgers of flesh, kept in the sleeve beneath my robe. I did not write there because they were not official, but I kept them because they were proof that the thing I feared losing still existed. There was an officer who noticed my slowness, an austere man with a voice that made the scriptorium quiet when he spoke. He did not accuse. He rarely spoke my name. He tapped his command seal against the ledger and asked questions that sounded like prayers. "Careful with the dates," he said once, peering over my shoulder. "The faithful need truth." I nodded. Truth in that office meant entries that would hold up under scrutiny. It never meant the warmth of someone's hand. The man left without seeing my hands reach under my robe to stroke the ribbon I hid there. The first time a real danger presented itself, it arrived wrapped in ordinary duty. A confession packet came with urgency stamped into its edges, as if the courier had run through the square and pressed the wax before the tremor left his hand. The piece of parchment inside was quick and tidy: name, transgression, a plea for penance. I usually transcribe such things without hesitation. This time, as the nib hovered above the line where the penitent's name belonged, a memory surfaced so sharp it was like a splinter catching in the tongue. I could see the face that had been blurring more clearly than I had in days. For a moment the room was not dim. The columns brightened, the air smelled like sun-warmed stone, and I could remember the tilt of a smile. The image felt illicit, as if recollection were a forbidden spice. I clung to it, the way one clings to breath underwater. My hand hovered. The order of the day insisted I ink the name and move on. The rest of the office continued its quiet machinery. Other quills scraped, other prayers were murmured to order. I found the act of writing suddenly monstrous. To place that name beneath the pen and fold the life into the ledger, would mean that the face I had re-seen would slip away again, perhaps forever. To refuse would be to risk a reprimand, or worse, to withhold an official record from the ecclesiarchy. Duty pressed like a palm against my back. The memory pressed like a different palm, pleading. I did something small and foolish. I closed the booklet, not the ledger, but the small volume where I had begun to keep those private tokens. The ribbon brushed my fingers the way a living thing might. I slid the confidential confession aside and reached instead for a scrap of paper I had kept from the day I had first learned to hold a quill. On it was a line from a joke the woman had told me, a ridiculous line about ink and prayer. It was not much, but it was an anchor. My mouth found its shape. I repeated the joke under my breath until the syllables burned with belonging. The officer's footsteps came nearer, and I could feel the duty tightening around that choice like a noose. He would want the ledger updated. He would expect me to be efficient. The confession waited, its urgency like a soft but insistent knock. I stared at the blank space where a name should be, at the tiny pool of black at the tip of my nib. The quill quivered. In the scriptorium, time had taken on a new texture, moments stretched like taffy, where once they had been steady bricks. The decision was not moral only. It would be practical as well. If I refused now, I would have to account for the refusal. I would have to explain why I had delayed the ritual of converting life into ledger language. My hand moved toward the ink and then away. I slid the confession into the fold of the ledger, not yet inscribed, and I stood. The room smelled of smoke and vellum and the faint, impossible memory of her perfume. I left my bench without a sound, the quill resting uncapped on the table like an accusation. In the corridor, the light was thinner, and the world outside the scriptorium felt suddenly louder. I had to decide what to do with a memory that cost me more than the ecclesiarchy's account book would ever record. I had to decide whether I would continue to be the hand that rendered lives into absolutes, or whether I would try, for once, to keep something from being consumed. I walked toward the lower archives, where old volumes slept and forgotten relics were sometimes mislaid, thinking I could find proof of the face that was fading. Whether I would return the confession to its place, sign it properly, or keep it closed and hide its name from the ledger was a choice that had weight. My footfalls echoed. The door to the archives was cold in my palm. I pushed it. My hand hovered above the vellum, the quill trembling between finger and palm like a living thing. The lamp oil hissed in the brazier and sent a pale, insectile light over the page. The ledger waited with the patience of a cathedral, patient, implacable, hungry. I could hear the faint hum in the room, not mechanical, not entirely human either. It was the low, sanctioned vibration the Ministorum called the canticle, a chorus of harmonics woven into the bindings and pages. It meant the rite was ready. It meant the ledger had already begun to take. They teach you to steady your breath. They teach you to let the memory go a little at a time, like unwinding twine, so you need give no more than the law requires. They teach you the litany for every parish, every station. The words ease the transfer, make the memory thin enough to be transcribed. The first time I performed the rite on an ordinary name, an elderly widow, a midwife long dead, I felt only a small unthreading. A scent, a turn of phrase, a single July afternoon gone. The ledger accepted the tithe without protest. The ink cooled black and true, and the name sat alive on the page while the part of me that had held it receded like a tide. This name was different. Her name lived on the tip of my tongue, like a coin I had folded and refolded since childhood. It had weight. It had the taste of steel and spiced porridge and the sound of rain on corrugated roofs. The ledger did not merely demand a portion of recollection, it demanded fidelity. To bind her was to sever the knot that bound name to memory inside me. to hand the knot over to parchment and prayer and let the Ministorum schedule her remembrance for the liturgies. To omit her was to deny the right, to keep my own recollection intact and risk the cathedral's auditors, those pale men and women who smelled of cold paper and accusation, prying into the register with flame-bright instruments and a will for exactitude. They would notice an absence. They would ask why, and if I could not answer with the exactitude the ledger expected, they would strip more than pages from me. I could feel the tithe gathering at the base of my skull as if a cold coin were dropping into a dark well. Small motes, fragments really, stirred behind my eyes. They were not visual so much as attitudinal. The way she corrected me when I mispronounced a prayer, the small defiance she kept for birds trapped in gutters, the way she hated the taste of sweet wines and feigned enjoyment in the company of a priest to spare his feelings. They collected like dust and glitter in my mind. The ledger would take them, and in exchange, it would hold her true. I drew in a slow breath and let it out through my teeth. The quill touched parchment. The lamp's flame made a halo around my hand and traced the small tremor of my wrist as I wrote the first letter. Ink bled slightly, black as a beetle wing, and the glyphs drank it up as if they were mouths. The canticle rose a notch in pitch. I did not believe in miracles the way the sermon makers described them. I had not seen angels, nor had I felt the Emperor's hand on my shoulder. But I had seen what the ledger did. I had watched faces shine on pages and be kept whole in the cadence of recited prayers while the living relatives forgot lines in laughter. The Ministorum called it preservation. My training called it service. My heart called it a debt. Memory, I learned, was not an inside thing alone. It could be handed over like a relic. You could lay a memory on altar cloth and have the clergy anoint it so others could access it in chant and image. But the ledger's method was more intimate and more brutal. It required a scribe to offer a tithe, an actual shoring up of a thought's edges, so the name would not rot in mere ink but become a vessel in the cathedral's liturgy. The ledger had a hunger for the scribe's interior life. It wanted the way I loved as much as it wanted the name written down. Halfway through her surname, my fingers abandoned the steady script I had practiced for years. I felt for a moment like two people vying for the same space, the me who had learned the necessity of sacrifices, and the me who had loved the woman enough to memorize the sentence of her face. A thin, personal rebellion flared inside my chest. Keep the name out of the register and keep her in the warm cell of my memory. Omit her and save myself the erasure. But that would be cowardice as surely as binding her might be injustice. The candle guttered, and I imagined the memory as a shape of light, one I could cup and set aside somewhere safe. I let the image of her come forward, the angle of her jaw when she argued scripture with a zealot, the scar at the base of her thumb from a child's toy, the way she whistled when she slept, and how the sound kept its wrong notes precisely where I would eventually learn to love them. They came like offerings. Each one left a paler impression behind, like a coin struck faint on cloth. I felt the ledger leaning toward me, patient and inevitable. The ritual demanded naming out loud. The litany had to be spoken while the ink cooled. The ledger would not accept a whisper after the quill lifted. So I began, syllables built into the old chant that made everything feel both holy and forcibly precise. My voice wavered. The first times I had performed this, my tongue was sure and my cadence unremarkable. Tonight the cadence cracked. The words became staccato like someone speaking through a mouthful of ash. As I enunciated the final consonant, something inside me unclipped. It was neither audible bells nor the flash of memory. It was a sensation, a physical loosening, like a thread giving way under the strain of too many hands pulling it. The ledger pulsed, a warmth spreading through the parchment into my fingers. The first fragment left me without leaving me. It wasn't an image collapsing, but a softening of edges. Her hair, once sharply detailed in my mind, blurred at the tips. The sound of her whistling dissolved into the room's background hum. Where there had been a mosaic of tiny particulars, there now remained only the large tiles. Love, anger, the shape of a life. The ledger accepted the tithe, and it took more than I had anticipated in those first breaths. I tasted the memory like salt in my mouth, a small metallic tang that left the back of my throat raw. If you have ever mislaid a household treasure, an old locket or a child's drawing, you know the sudden, ridiculous panic that follows. You look and you can't find it. You search, and you feel as if something vital has rearranged itself in the room of your life. This was that panic, but internal and sanctioned. It was expropriation for worship. There is a calculus in every scribe's head. Name worth saved versus memory to keep. The ledger was the mind of the cathedral to anger. It was to invite auditors whose questions were knives. I had seen auditors before. They arrived with faces as pale as washed linen and eyes like ledger lines. They did not speak in simple sentences. They operated in interrogatories and footnotes. They could declare a page compromised and demand the scribe's account, and if the account failed to satisfy them, they could unbind other things, lessons, privileges, a scribe's very place among the faithful. Their penalties were not always visible. Sometimes they took your rank. Sometimes they took your right to perform a rite at all, ever again. Sometimes they took memories in place of pages. The Ministorum's arbor was kind in name only. So I weighed the scales like a grocer, one palm containing the warmth of a remembered touch, the other the cold promise of institutional protection. In the balance, duty always had a heavier weight. I had sworn my hand to the ledger years ago, under the watchful eyes of canons who spoke of service and sacrifice with the fervor of the devout. They had taught me to make hard choices. Still, it did not make them less wrenching. The ledger sank deeper. I could feel the arcane filaments knit between its spine and my thoughts, a lattice work that captured the specific timing of our shared laughter, the way she had once cursed the wind. With each tendril that set itself, that portion of her receded into the page. The ink shone briefly, as if wet with tears, and then dried, leaving finality stitched into the grooves. Her name sat on the vellum, as if it had always belonged there. A peculiar thing happened as more of her left my head. My own reflection in the brass of the inkpot grew sharper in the glass. In losing small particles of her, I became oddly conscious of myself, the way a hand feels pruned after a long bath. Memory is a room you furnish with other people's. Objects removing one chair can make the layout seem different. I began to notice my own habits, the way I chewed the inside of my cheek when uncertain, the small tremor in my right shoulder when I lied to patrons. Those things had been present all along, but now they stepped forward. It was as if the ledger's hunger made room for other things in me. I thought of the liturgies where the cathedral would call her name, and everyone would remember her, as the Ministorum required. They would recite her virtues with exactness. Children would be taught her pieties. The choir would hold a note for her praise. Her life would be preserved in a way wider than any single affection. That comfort, thin as it was, mattered. The Ministorum kept people alive for prayer. That was a sacred act, and yet there was grief braided through that supposed comfort. The ledger's preservation turned the beloved into an emblem. It shielded against oblivion, but also against the messy, private particulars that make a person not just an edict, but a touchable presence. If the ledger took her, I would not be able to summon the grit of her laughter in the middle of winter, when everything else around me had hardened. I would not know the exact way she propped her chin when she said a lie to spare someone. Her memory would be both safe and sanitized. My palm grew slick with sweat where it pressed the quill. The canticle swelled again, and with it came a sense of motion, a suggestion that someone or something had noticed the ledger's work. In the thin light, I could see the inked name like a small island in a sea of blank, and on that island I had just set down a life. The impulse to close the book and walk away was strong, to walk the corridor, to hide the memory under my cloak where no auditor could find it. But the ledger had been touched. It would not unaccept what it had accepted without consequence. I realized then that the true tithe was not the small image I had lost, but the surrender of ownership. To bind her was to admit she belonged to the cathedral as much as she had belonged to me. To omit her would be to keep ownership, but risk the ire of those who watched for such concealments. Every scribe's life turned on such calculations. We learned to be precise with our affections. The final syllable escaped me like a secret. The canticle dropped to silence. The page cooled. For an instant there was a sensation like a small seal closing over my chest, a neat and painless snap. Then a thinner sound, my own breath filled the room. I lifted my head and searched for the image of her face. Where there should have been clarity, I found a large, gentle shape, love defined, not illustrated. The edges were softened. Details that had once been razor-sharp bled like watercolor in rain. I tried to recall the precise nickname she used for me, a ridiculous and private thing we had never spoken in public. It hovered at the periphery, like a moth against a lamp. I could almost reach it. Almost, but not quite. The ledger lay open before me, its new entry complete, its promise of preservation satisfied. My hand shook as if from a chill. I had given up small things without realizing the cost. I had done what I was trained to do. I had served the Ministorum with the exactness the cathedral expected. Beyond the little chamber where I worked, footsteps moved along the corridor. Firm, measured steps that meant someone came from the higher transept. The sound arrived like a clock signaling a new hour. I straightened, the ledger's weight suddenly more than physical. My finger steadied on the quill once more, not to write, but to close. I looked at the name I had just given away, at the neat line of script that kept her safe for others, while unreeling part of her from my mind. I had bound her. The decision sat in me like a wound that would not bleed, but would ache in slow, civilized ways. My breath returned to its natural rhythm. Behind the door, footsteps paused. I set the quill down with a resolve that was both small and seismic. The next steps would be decisive. I reached for the ledger's clasp, and the world contracted to the act of closing the book. The auditor did not so much enter the scriptorium as arrive like an edict, a presence pressed the air until the candles leaned away. He wore no flourish, only a thin gray robe and the indifferent geometry of someone who had been given permission to unmake lives with a single signature. The archivist Cantor stood to receive him with the ritual stiff smile of an office that had seen worse and measured it into tidy columns. They seated me between them as if I were a ledger that must be balanced by touch alone. The auditor's fingers rested for a long moment on the sheet where I had changed a marginal note. I could still feel the ghost of the smudge on my thumb, an invisible smear I had thought vanished when the ink dried. He read the ledger aloud, syllable by syllable, as if speech could restore omission to sin. Every line he read made the room colder. When he reached my altered margin, he paused and let the silence widen until the wax in the seals cracked. "Tell us why," Archivist Cantor said. His voice was not unkind. It was not required to be kind. Words like armor formed in my throat. I had practiced evasion the way a man practices prayer, neat, rehearsed, plausible. I could say it was a tremor of the lamp, a blot of old wetness. I could say I had corrected my own sloppiness. Any smallness, any human excuse would do. and the Ministorum loved human excuses because they kept the machinery humming. But the ledger was not merely ink, it was testimony, and in our faith, testimony could become law. They began the process anyway. They called it lustration. The archivist Cantor called it that, with a title that made the word sound like cleanliness and sanctity. The auditor called it by no name at all, as if names were luxuries for those not tasked with exposure. A junior acolyte brought a bowl of water, scented faintly with juniper. Another set a small vial of ink that had been blessed by the sacristy. Rituals layered over investigation, like linen bandages over a wound. I watched them prepare my confession, as if I were watching someone else script my fate. A pen, thin and merciless, was passed to me. I dipped it in the sanctioned ink and felt the wetted tip tremble at the seam between my fingers. The taste of it was metallic and made my mouth go dry. They told me what to write. They told me the words to place under my signature. They said that the truth would serve us poorly. The truth, at that hour, would rend our precinct and invite worse. It was not yet a demand to betray a stranger. It was a request dressed in liturgy. If I signed the supplied confession, if I agreed that the irregularity in my ledger had been deliberate but minor, I would save the precinct from the auditor's deeper scrutiny. The auditor had a way of opening one wound and then widening it, looking for infection. If I did not sign what they wanted, they warned, the examiner's remit extended until it touched those above me, and the penalties compounded. The archivist Cantor's hands, folded, looked like a basket of coals. They offered a different mercy too. Finish the confession, but write a name. Supply a reason. They would accept the substitution, and the penalties would be directed outward. Anonymity could be formalized into blame. The Ministorum's machinery loved triage. It preferred a single, visible sacrifice to the slow decay of distrust spreading through its ranks. I thought of faces, not abstract faces, the small, specific gestures that map a man in your memory. Brother Matthews chewing the corner of his lip when reciting the ledgers, Sister Elira with her steady, precise looped handwriting, the acolyte who used to hum the litanies off-key. They were not names in a file. They were places where loyalty lived, small homesteads of humanity in a sea of doctrine. To point at one of them was to take a hammer to a personal geography I had spent years sketching in ink and time. The archivist Cantor watched me choose, as a craftsman watches wood yield to a plane. "We ask you to consider the greater good," he said softly. "One error, corrected, is an offering. The precinct will stand. The people here will continue their work." He meant the machine. He did not say the price. He was a man trained to cut corners into straight edges and name the bleed as necessary. I saw the auditor smile once, very slightly, as if approval had been a commodity that could be granted in a single small movement. He slid a packet across the table. Inside were the words pre-written: admission, contrition, and a name on a line left deliberately blank. The name was a key. When filled, it would redirect the hinge of the investigation. It would designate the body upon which the discipline would act. I realized then that my smudge was not the problem, it was an opportunity, and I was the reluctant locksmith. There was a moment when fear and self-preservation polished each other into clarity. If I refused, the auditor could demand all my private ledgers. He could order interrogation, sequester my papers, and then I would watch colleagues be called in, watch them answer for the omissions found in pages I had touched. It would not end at me. The ecclesiarchy's machinery was not designed to terminate at the root, it sought branches. I picked up the pen. My hand did not tremble as much as my chest did. The confession they had provided smelled of warmed vellum and incense, but the name I wrote tasted like iron. I chose a name that would not be a leader, but a convenient sinew. I could tell myself I spared greater numbers, that a single life might hold a leak and prevent a flood. The pen moved like an instrument anesthetizing a patient. I filled the blank line with ink and watched how the letter settled into permanence. Once the name was there, the room altered. The archivist Cantor nodded to the auditor as if a ritual had been completed. The acolyte with the juniper water stepped forward to wash my hands, but I jerked back and the water spilled down the table like a small confession of its own. The auditor did not appear surprised that my skin had not yet accepted absolution. To Hoti, him, my resistance was merely part of the process. They required me to sign as witness. My signature, my hand, my entire craft of ledger keeping validated what I had filled in. To sign was not merely to confess, it was to testify that I had seen the accused admit. My pen carved my own complicity into the record. I felt the ink sink into the fibers of the page, the way a bruise might settle under skin. It would not be visible to the untrained eye, but I knew where the deposit lay. I knew how to trace it back. Afterward, they brought the accused in. He had eyes that registered shock, then a searching disbelief that read like a plea. He had been summoned under the pretense of administrative review, and now found himself in the theater of penance. They bound him with cords that were more thrum than pain. There were chants, words shaped to constrict, and a small collar placed about his neck that bore the precinct mark. It was not the raw cruelty of execution, but there are punishments that carve just as deep. The censure, the public penance, the slow professional exile that turned a man into an absence. I was asked to prepare the statement he would read. I wrote the words they fed me, the litany of admissions, the part about misunderstanding and deviation, the lines that would allow him to kneel and be absolved without challenging the werewolf at the center of the system. They required detail. They wanted me to craft a narrative of guilt that would sit well in the mouths of the congregation. The acolyte who delivered the chant adjusted his voice to fit the cadences. The room readied itself to reassign blame. When the man spoke, his voice shook at first, then steadied beneath a mantle of liturgy. He said words I had placed into his hands. He looked at me once, no more than a nod, a question without speech, and then lowered his head. The congregation accepted the script because the page had sanctioned it. The procedure closed like a lock. I felt something leave me, like the shaken last of a candle in the draft. Yet even as the auditorium of my conscience quieted, another sound drew near beyond the scriptorium doors, the footfall of the precinct's external enforcers, precise and inevitable. They had come to carry through the sentence, public abjuration, reassignation, and the paperwork to seal the erasure. They would march the condemned past altars and names, past well-wrapped reputations, and the crowd would watch and believe. Standing there, ink still on my fingers, and the taste of metallic compromise at the back of my throat, I understood the second part of the offer I had been given. Complicity would preserve the precinct for now. It would preserve my station for a time. But it would also build a ledger of debts I could not repay with ordinary penance. There are actions the Ministorum forgives easily, and others it keeps on file, like acid that eats through the ledger's paper and never stops. I looked at the archivist Cantor and saw, not malice, but calculation. He had given me choices framed as mercy and duty, and one of them I had taken. The auditor prepared his seal as if to close a book. The condemned man was being led away to perform the masked rituals that would save the rest. I felt the air shift because of footsteps leaving. What remained in the room was not quiet. It was an accusation I had written myself. I knew then that silence offers two exits. The one I had taken, which kept the precinct functioning at the cost of others, and the other, far graver and lonelier, which would be to speak plainly, to hand the auditor a different page, to expose process and risk everything. Saying nothing was an action too. I had chosen a temporary survival. I had become, by tiny increments, the kind of scribe who could be summoned to justify purges. They left me with the ledger, the weight of 1,000 sanctioned strokes. The archivist Cantor said, almost gently, "Tend your hand. There will be more to record." Those words were a benediction and a bind. I closed the ledger and felt the seam of my life flex under the pressure of a decision I could no longer avoid. The corridor beyond the scriptorium thrummed with distant chanting, and I could hear the crowd assembling for the abjuration procession. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, I understood what I might do next. Either follow them and offer the crowd a lie that would keep me safe, or slip the ledger into my satchel and walk out the side door they always left unguarded. The side door would make me an enemy of the ecclesiarchy in a way that would be worse than a private damnation. It would make my face a node on a map. I opened the full page of the ledger before me and felt the paper's slight resistance under my fingertips. The ink of the confession glistened, drying like a promise. My thumb hovered over the seam where one thread of paper met another. I had one small, precise motion left to choose the shape of everything that came after. My hand knew the work before my mind did. I had inked 1,000 names by the time the light in my lamp had gone thin and the chapel's chant had swollen into something like a sea. I wrote the first line without thinking, the quill moving over vellum with a sure, mechanical grace. Then the second line named a person I had promised to hide, and the quill snagged. The feather trembled in my grip like a wing that had forgotten flight. Around me, the scriptorium had become a place of small absences. Colleagues who once leaned over one another's desks to laugh now kept their shoulders turned, as if the angle of their bodies might shield them from whatever it was I wore across my skin. An old woman whose crow's feet had once led her into pinches of mirth slid past my alcove and refused to meet my eyes. A junior clerk stopped bringing me trays of cold broth. He set them on the far side of the table and made excuses about a confessor's scrutiny. You learn quickly in the Ministorum how suspicion smells. The vinegar of whispered litany, the metallic tang in the air when someone's name is touched. My own memories thinned. I would be halfway through a liturgical invocation and realize the cadence was not mine. The words fell from my tongue as if someone else had taught me to pray in the night. I would close my eyes and try to find the lesson's face. There was a blank, like moth-eaten cloth stretched over a frame. The more I kept safe, the more I was emptied out. I could still draw a perfect capital V with a single, obedient stroke. I could still account for tithes and offerings and the exact weight of a condemned man's coin. But the faces behind the entries moved farther away in ways the ink could not anchor. Those I had sheltered paid their own ledgers on different counters. One family was marched to exile under a sky so low with ash it seemed the Imperium itself had folded over them to hide them. Another had their names ritualized away, struck through by someone with the authority to make absence law. I had written protective notations in the margins, a flourish here, a loop there, small things that meant, in the right hands, that a registrar would overlook an identity. But the authorities read the regular text and not the margins. When they came for the first household, I saw a child clutch a doll and realized the rasps I had heard in my chest were not meant for me alone. The ledger had kept them breathing. The ledger had taken my breath as payment. I became aware of how loyalty is counted. It was not in grand vows. It was measured in hairline losses, a childhood memory slipping like a coin from a pocket, a favorite psalm dissolving into a hum I could not match to voice. There were nights I woke reciting a benediction I could not say where I had learned it, waking to find the candle stubbed to a nubbled cone and my own hand stained with someone else's ink. The ledger took small things and left large, alarming holes. Each stitch I made to close their wounds pulled another seam through me. And then there was the choice, sudden and clear, as the strike of a bell at matins. Confess to a confessor, reveal what I had done, risk my position, my immunity, the precarious shelter I could offer, and by doing so, risk dragging into the light every name I had tried to protect. Or keep paying the toll, continue to falsify registers, continue to kneel at the ledger until my knees grew calloused and the world narrowed to script and secrecy. Either way, someone would lose something irretrievable. Either way, the ledger marked the sacrifice. I thought of the confessor. He wore his authority like a coin on a chain, heavy and polished. His voice could turn a choir into supplication. His judgment could send a man to penance or to oblivion. To go to him meant to place the people I had shielded into the hands of doctrine. To stay silent meant to become complicit in a slow, private death of self. The Ministorum's theology had many names for sacrifice. None fitted the quiet dissolutions that had been my nights, the night I chose. The rain hammered the cathedral roof in small, steady fingernails. Outside, the city's gutters made a metallic whisper. Inside, the lamps smelled of resin and old wool. I drew the ledger to me as if it were both shield and altar. The book was heavy, its boards creaked with the memory of hands. I opened to the page where the lines gathered like small constellations, names I had shifted, entries I had rewritten with one eye on the ledger's formal law, and another on the margin where id sketched a cipher. I brewed a small lamp of oil and placed beside it a thin iron stylus, warmed over the flame until it glowed like the edge of a coin. I had seen the stylus used once at a purging, an official strike meant to render a legal mark irrevocable. It seared. It was simple and final. I thought for a long, ridiculous moment of confession. I imagined the confessor's fingers probing the ledger's pages and finding my marginal notes, the little knots of intent I had tucked between lines. I imagined him lifting his head, the church's incense haloing him, and pronouncing sentence. Exile by edict, name struck entirely, loyalty misconstrued as treachery. The thought of his ash-colored face, filling with pity or revulsion, twisted in me the same way a bruise does under a thin skin. To confess would be to raise my voice and collapse the careful architecture of safety I had built, brick by secret brick. Instead, I took the stylus to the margin and traced a single, deliberate line through my own name. My name was written at the front of every ledger I touched, an administrative necessity, a clerk's brand. I had watched others sign and be given paper reliefs and pass tokens. This name had been my keystone. With the stylus, I burned a mark that severed that keystone from everything else. The heat made the vellum snap and sing. It filled the scriptorium with the sharp smell of singed ink and the metallic tang of scorched glue. The line I made was not a casual flourish. It was a ritual of self-annihilation disguised as bureaucracy. It crossed my name with an obliterating strip of heat that warped the fibers of the page. The letters bubbled and blackened, then settled into a hollow, ridged scar. Ink pooled at the edges like coagulated shadow. When the stylus cooled, it hissed politely on the page, as if the ledger had been a living thing that wanted to exhale. I had intended, perhaps subconsciously, to remove all my marginal annotations. I would incinerate every protective sign I had left where an inquisitive eye might find them. But the stylus found my name first. It lay there in the morning's neat script, a record of a man who had once been counted by an order. That cross through it was a contracting of the world. It said to the books, and to the clerks, and to whatever bureaucratic gaze might later comb these pages, this scribe no longer answers for his ink. He is not to be called upon. If you seek testimony, seek elsewhere. The act was small, grotesquely administrative, a single line of molten iron, but it made a different kind of noise altogether. It made me feel, oddly, like a bell rung. Around that bell's vibration, the rest of the room aligned. A flask tipped slightly from the shelf in a far corner. A page turned of its own accord. I could feel the ledger weighing less on my lap, as if some portion of it had been cut free. There was a cost, immediate and sharp. A warmth bloomed at the base of my skull and folded down my throat like a tide. Memory pulled at the edges, wanting to follow the heat into the page's scar. I felt something, the shape of a childhood hymn, the face of someone who had laughed at my first mistake. Want to step into the line of the burn and vanish. I resisted with a single focused thought. Protect them. The resistance felt like tacking cloth to a table while a blade slid beneath it. It hurt. Outside, footsteps sounded, a slow, measured tread that could not belong to a clerk. Someone moved in the gallery above, the soft swick of the coffered board announcing approach. I ran a rag over the hot mark, dabbing the residual oil and the tiny charred beads that clung to the edges of the scars. Each bead was like a promise of erasure. I kissed them with cloth and watched them dull. I had sealed myself to silence in a way even the confessor could not easily undo. To confess would now be complicated by my own removal. If they came looking for testimony from me, the ledger would say I had no formal standing. If they demanded I disclose names, the same page I had once used to hide would show a scribe whose official place had been struck and burned. It was not the same as going to the confessor and asking mercy. It was a preemptive exile written into bureaucracy. For a moment I sat and let the heat of the stylus cool into my palm. My fingers smelled of ink and iron and resin. I felt the ledger's weight again, but different. Less a ledger than a coffin lid I had hammered shut. The choices laid themselves like small weapons on the table. Confess and risk everything, or stay and become a ghost within the church I had served. I rose, the lamp pitching a narrow cone of light. The scriptorium around me blinked in the dark. The junior clerk's footsteps had stopped. Someone was pausing to listen. I tucked the ledger under my robe, feeling the ridge of the burned line through the fabric like a seam against my ribs. It pressed against me with the intimacy of a scar. I had made a decision that would not be undone. I had not gone to the confessor. I had not dragged others into the harsh light. Instead, I had cut myself out of the ledger's comfortable accounting and made of myself a blank that could not be cross-examined. There would be consequences. There always were consequences, but they would be mine alone to weather. They would be the slow corrosion of memory, the erosion of self, until I could not tell which vows were mine and which had been borrowed. The people I kept safe would go on, with their patched lives, unaware of the small sacrifice that kept their names tucked into the margin. As I moved toward the arch that led from the scriptorium to the choir, the corridor breathed cold against my face. The gusset of night beyond the arch seemed deeper than it had been before. Behind me, the lamp on my desk guttered and threw its last reluctant shadow across the charred line. Ahead of me, a door was closing somewhere, soft and deliberate. I could hear the whisper of cassocks against stone. I set my shoulder to the ledger and walked. My steps were steady. Each one felt like an accounting, a credit given, a debt assumed. The ledger, with the permanent line burned through it, lay at my heart like a lit ember. I did not know if this act would spare them for weeks or years, whether it would be found and misunderstood or never read at all. I only knew the shape of my resolve. Keep them hidden, keep paying the cost, become the margin. The corridor swallowed my figure and the sound of my sandals, and the church's distant organ rose as if to watch me pass. The first light in the nave always came slow, like a confession worked out in stages. The glass threw long, dull columns across the stone. Incense hung in the air, a warm grit against my tongue. I was already at the ledger when the bell finished its fourth knell. My name sat beneath the title, as it had for years, neat and deliberate, in the hand I had learned to make steady over parchment and prayer. They read those letters from the pulpit sometimes, as if naming me reminded the congregation there was order here, that someone answered for the inventory of souls. The sound of my name there felt like a coin placed on a grave. It paid for a thing I barely owned anymore. My voice had become a tool more than a part of me. When I spoke the litany at dawn, people prayed with the cadence I was given, rather than the weight of any feeling behind the syllables. They closed their eyes at the proper places, mouths moving with the rhythm the cathedral provided. The acoustics ate the edges of my words and returned them sanctified. I heard my voice echo back, and it sounded older, practiced, as if it belonged to the building more than the man who spoke it. I could stand beneath the arch and read entries all day, births, names, transfers, absolutions, and afterward not recall a single face attached to the lines I had penned. There was a cost written into the work in a way no one spoke aloud. Each ledger we kept consumed something of the hand that kept it. I had watched the ink spread and thought of rivers. Lines taken in the right order, prayers set to margin, and a life was recorded and secured. The ledger preserved that soul, counted them, kept them from being lost to the warp of chaos or the indifferent registrar of war. In return, the ledger also asked for pieces of memory as payment. You did not notice at first. A name would slip like a small coin from the purse of recollection, then another, and the world would feel more orderly because the ledger demanded that order, but quieter where people ought to have shouted. We tried experiments on myself at impossible hours, lighting a single candle and reading aloud entries backwards, or writing a name twice, once in formal script and once in a smaller, secret hand at the bottom margin. The cathedral had rules for everything: types of ink, lineation for family names, a thumbprint of the rector for every baptism. I found that when I bent those rules, memory resisted. A name written twice would cling to me longer, and a face might persist for a day. But the correction would cost me in other ways. A fragment from my childhood would drift into void. A laughter that had once belonged to someone I loved would go slack and anonymous. It was like bartering with your own closet of recollections. The ecclesiarchy preserved the world, and I paid them in the currency of myself. The people I had saved, I used that word like a hammer because it carried weight, lived on under the Ministorum's watch. They were fed, their sins catalogued, their vocations assigned. They attended the masses, nodded when the rector spoke of duty, and their children received the appropriate rites. I could see them in the nave sometimes, anonymous among the rows, mouths moving in unison. The ledger had given them a name and a place, and on paper they were safe. But safety was not memory. I would pass a woman in the cloister whose entry I had signed with my own hand, but when I searched my mind for the exact shade of her hair or the shape of the scar she'd shown me so we might claim her as one of ours, there was only warmth where detail should have been. I could say she existed. I could not say why she mattered to me. It made the work feel like a law of physics. We produced order and the price extracted was precise. The ledger wants accuracy to keep it accurate. We give it anchors drawn from within us. Names are not merely ink, they are hooks hammered into memory. When the hooks are driven into the cathedral's book instead of my head, the souls are secured, but I become a man whose shelves are thinning. I could defend that bargain with the kind of rhetoric honed in rote prayers. A saved soul counted is worth saving. And that defense was not without truth. The problem was that truth sat on a scale, and the weight shifted, imperceptible at first, until something essential slipped off. I used to know why I had chosen the pen. Once, laughter pulled me toward the scriptorium like light. I had loved the pattern of letters, the curl of a tail, the way a line could hold a person. Now I could mimic that affection. My hand made beautiful strokes, as though affection lived in muscle memory. But when I reached inward for the sensation that had guided me to become a scribe, my mind gave me a fog, warmth without shape, devotion without reference. I had defended the cathedral's work in private debates, in letters to a friend now long dead or promoted. But when I tried to recall the shape of that friendship, I felt only the echo of argument, the fact that I loved something rather than a single feature of its face. There were rituals they would not permit to be violated, liturgies that steadied the faithful. But there were also small rebellions one could afford in the margins. My handwriting hid cipher beneath the flourish of a serif. I would take a name, one that had lodged in my chest like a splinter, and fold it into a phrase that looked like doctrine. The chapter would glance at my marginalia, find a useful aphorism, and file it as clerical pomposity. Beneath the acceptable surface, I could sometimes keep a filament of memory intact. It was not much. It was a private language that only my eye could read, until my eye forgot too. One morning, I reached for a page, and my fingers hesitated before the name that sat like a stone in the book. The entry was complete. Birth date, sponsor, prayerful notation, my mark. In the margin, in the forgotten hand, I had written something personal, an apology, a place name, a joke. I could not fully remember the joke. I tried to reconstruct it by tracing the ink with my nail, feeling the indentations of each letter. The more I tried, the further the memory receded. It was as if the cathedral required the margins be blank of anything personal. The ledger wanted souls and bureaucratic truth, not the messy weight of why one soul might be dearer to a scribe. In the quiet that followed that failure, I felt the choice most clearly. The ledger would always be there, a catalog that outlived me, a thing that could be read cleanly years later when my name was already an epitaph. It would shelter names from the ruin of war, from the administrative erasure of famine and plague. That shelter cost me my particular map of the world, the private atlas of faces and favors that had once made me human in the small ways that mattered. I could accept the trade in full, continue to sign, to speak, to let the ledger take the shapes of those I once knew, and sleep under the certainty that the ecclesiarchy had done what it must. Or I could stop, try to hold my memory intact, but risk that those souls would drift uncounted. The cathedral does not tolerate indecision for long. Decisions here were often made by motion more than argument. A quill poised, a wax seal broken, a bell struck. I stood with the quill between my fingers and thought of faces I could not conjure, of a small boy's clasped hand that I had led to the baptismal font and whose laughter had once filled a corridor. I tried to summon that laugh and drew only a blank like a smoothed pebble. The ledger had the boy's date of birth, his sponsor, the exact phrasing of his entry. On paper, he was not lost. In my head, he had been folded into the cathedral's care and stripped of the idiosyncrasy that made him beloved. I could justify the taking 1,000 ways. One saved soul meant more than one scribe's memory. Ledger full of names could steady a region under the Ministorum's watch and prevent the sort of chaos that swallowed families whole. I told myself that order triumphed over sentiment, that argument sounded honorable if one kept the rhetoric crisp and the ink line perfectly straight. But the truth that day felt different. The ledger preserved bodies of knowledge and bodies of people, yes, and in doing so, it hollowed the living recorder. There was a grief that had no proper tone in the liturgy. I placed the quill back into its well, hands steady now, whether from resolve or resignation, I could not tell. The ink glinted black and committed. In the center of the page, where my name was always found, the letters stared up like a small, unrepentant truth. I could see the rector's seal pressed into the corner of the ledger and feel the building's low, satisfied hum as if it were pleased with our mutual exchange. My palms smelled of cinnamon and old paper. I remembered a phrase about duty, or perhaps I had invented it then to soften the ache. Either way, I could not remember the face I had been trying to keep. There remained one act, small and dangerous by cathedral standards, that pulled at the back of my throat like a thing wanting to be sung. The ink in the well would take any name, and the margins could receive a secret. I could write a name in a code that only my battered memory recognized. I could tuck it into a psalm so the book body would shield it, and when the ledger fed on my memory, the hidden mark might slip through, an ember kept out of the fire. It was no surety. It was perhaps cowardice, perhaps hope. It was a motion toward preservation in a place designed to unmake personal history. I uncapped the quill. The tip trembled but did not break. My hand hovered over the margin that had held so many small rebellions. I breathed once, a long, slow draft that tasted of dust and incense and the mechanical comfort of my profession, and began to write a single name in a cipher no one else would read. I did not stop to remember the face the name had once belonged to. I could not recall it now. Instead, I wrote the sound as if sound alone might anchor what the ledger could not hold. My stroke was deliberate. With each line I made, I felt the cathedral shift around me, as if it noticed the slight theft. I wrote small, and then smaller still, pressing the letters until the ink was hardly visible. When the final curve slid off the paper, I closed the book and laid the cover over the hiding place. The bell outside began its slow, accusing toll. I stood, ledger in hand, and stepped toward the nave. The congregation waited for a voice that had become a vessel. I tucked the hidden inscription into the folds of my sleeve and felt its tiny weight, like a promise. I did not know whether I had saved anything at all, or only delayed an erasure another day, but I had made a choice that was not wholly for the cathedral. As I reached the pulpit and felt the old wood beneath, my palms, something colder than regret and warmer than courage, moved in me. I opened my mouth and began to speak.